right, so we're going to check out The Snowman by Wallace Stevens, and then Disillusionment at 10 o'clock. Um, Before we jump into The Snowman, a little background about Stevens. He was obviously an American modernist poet. He was born in Reading, Pennsylvania, which is like a little north of Philadelphia, and he spent most of his life working as an executive from an insurance company out in Hartford, Connecticut. He eventually won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry for his collected poems in 1955. Now, out of, we looked at Pound, who's an imagist who has a very set sense of ideas, even though we discussed how Portrait d'une Femme, lacks many of the qualities of a concrete imagist piece. Wallace Stevens is not an imagist, right? If you remember, imagism has more to do with objectivity and an instant in time, and obviously an economy of words, etc. Stephen does not adhere to any of those ideas, right? There is a lot of question of subjectivity versus objectivity in his work, which we will discuss. But he was a philosopher of aesthetics, really, right? He was always vigorously exploring the notion of poetry as this supreme fusion of the creative imagination and objective reality, right? So, objectivity in The Snowman becomes quite important further along in the piece itself, but because of the extreme technical and thematic complexity of Stevens' work, he's sometimes considered a difficult poet. Difficult to understand, yeah, sometimes, but he was also acknowledged as an eminent abstractionist and a provocative thinker. Now, the main purpose of abstraction in art is not really to tell a story, right? But to encourage involvement of the imagination, right? Which The Snowman, we'll see, is in a lot of ways all about. It's an art form as its main objective to provide viewers with an intangible and emotional experience, right? Being completely different for each individual, depending on their personality and mood. Stevens contended that the poet's purpose was to interpret the external world of thought and feeling through imagination. Right? He thought that the 20th century was an age of disbelief, right, which is a very modernist concept, and saw poetry as a new form of spirituality in a lot of ways. All gods, Stephen thought, borrowed their power from the human world, which is, an idea that's been returned to again and again by writers. It's even addressed in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest surviving piece of literature that we have, right? It's a 4,000-year-old Mesopotamian story, and there's a scene in that. Well, it was originally discovered because there's a massive flood myth in it, right? So that's how people started researching it, because it was so similar to the Bible. But in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the gods flood the earth and kill the majority of people, there's also Utnapishtim, who has an ark, etc. But the idea is that the gods realize that they need humans to survive as well, right? So it's a very old idea, but Stevens is kind of putting a modernist twist on the idea of a modern poet's role was to return that borrowed glory or essence, or whatever you'd like to call it, to its origins, and in doing so, to provide men and women with a style of bearing themselves in reality, right? So Stevens was a very deep thinker. Um, Reality and imagination and perspective, right, are incredibly important in Stevens' work. We'll talk about all of those things when we look at disillusionment at 10 o'clock as well. So it's the idea that we create our own realities and can change the perception of the world around us through simple actions, right? We're not going to look at anecdote at the jar, but you were supposed to read it, and that's kind of what all that is about, right? This idea that you can make one action that kind of changes the world around you, right? But the snowman. So, the first question you should ask yourself is, who is the snowman? Is it the speaker? Is it the listener? Is it of another conscious or a subconscious ego, right? We're getting into that time in history where we're looking at psychoanalysis. So it's Stevens thought about that quite a bit as well. But the snowman really is about the complexities of the human mind and their perspective of seeing a thing, right? Which a thing, right, in quotes, goes back to Pound's imagist rules, right? Um, but in this piece, Stevens really incorporates the ideas of perspectivism, right? So according to him, the landscape does not change its color in response to any external stimuli, right? A person's mind is responsible for investing in a scene or a landscape, be it a wintry landscape or that summer, right? If no one is clear from these illusions, nature will portray the reality as it is. So, in its essence, this poem is a description of what it takes to correctly and, importantly, objectively observe a cold winter landscape, right? As well as the world at large for what it is, really, right? This is almost a set of rules for being able to objectively observe something. Um, so the snowman, the title itself, what exactly is the snowman? What's its role in the piece? Is it the speaker? Is it the subject, etc.? Really plays into that idea of objectivity, right? This person must not project their own or the world's problems onto an empty landscape, but they must see it for what it really is, right? It's important in its own right without an attempted personification of human emotion, right? That is one of the main ideas about this poem, is that a landscape has its own power without having to press human characteristics onto it, which in a lot of ways is a very naturalist idea as well. There isn't the violence conceptually there, but there is the idea that nature is just an objective reality, right? And if it's an objective reality, it doesn't really care about us at all, which is in a lot of ways a naturalist concept. But let's read this piece and then we will go through it stanza by stanza, kind of break it down. So, the snowman. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind, that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener, who listens in the snow, and nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. So, there's a lot going on there. The first stanza, right? One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow. Um, we'll talk about some of the literary devices in there in a second, but the first line itself begins with an impersonal pronoun, right? One. Um, and that's a substitute, arguably, for I, we could say, right? Which implies that this poem isn't about an individual experience. It's supposed to apply to everyone, right? Which makes it, in a way, instantly a little bit more objective. Um, must leaves no room for ambiguity, right? One must have a mind for winter. Um, you know, it's a proclamation in a lot of ways, right? Or a caveat. Um, and it's necessary to have this mind of winter to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, right? Um, that, in a lot of ways, is, again, if we're going to subtly relate some of Stephen's ideas to imagism, um, that is objective, right? To regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow. So, we can see glimpses of imagist descriptions in this piece, but it's not an imagist poem, right? So, to regard is to view or look at something attentively, right? So, in the first stanza, the focus is on the eye as the lens through which we see nature, right? One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost of the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow. So, one must be able to physically observe winter to really have a deeper understanding of it, right? And then we have, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter, right? Once again, there's no personification in here at all. Um, but the most important point here is going to be cold, right? Very easy to skip over. But there are two meanings of cold here, right? Obviously cold, right, in terms of temperature, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice. So we could interpret that in the sense that one must spend the appropriate time in a landscape to really understand it, to be able to describe it, right? So, if you're describing a wintry landscape, you must be cold a long time to really get it, right? You must stay out there in that weather for a while to really be able to take it in. But it's the other meaning of cold that makes it a little bit more interesting. You can also think of it as a metonym for peacefulness, right? So a metonym, right, uses metonymy, right, which is a figure of speech in which one object or idea takes the place of another with some form of close association. If you've ever heard like a businessman referred to as a suit, right? Um, or doesn't apply as much anymore since we have, color, um, but a silver screen for a movie screen, right? When it would have been black and white, are two really good examples of metonymy, right? But in terms of what's going on in the piece, it's important to note that both of the trees are evergreens, right? Junipers and spruces. So they're going to keep their needles throughout the winter. So in effect, winter has no grip on them, right? Unlike the speaker, who is feeling the effects of winter, we have these two trees that aren't affected by it, right? And then we have our third stanza of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, which is one of the most important points of this poem, in the sound of a few leaves, right? So the third stanza reveals the turning point in the poem, right? So the speaker is clearly advising the reader not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, right? That's personification. That is a subjective description. Um, and what Stevens is saying in this poem is that loses the true nature, right, of the vista that you're looking at, right? So you can see how Stevens has a lot of imagist ideas in this poem, even though it's not an imagist poem itself, right? Um, so, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place. Um, we have repetition in here, right? Sound the same, which reinforces the idea of a continual wind and bleakness. And these three lines are holding back, right? Reminding the reader that while stranded in the barren land, they are also becoming an integral part of the snowscape, right? Because remember, one of Stevens' biggest ideas is perspective and how we can change something um, by adding something to it, right? Or if you stand there long enough, you become part of the landscape, right? So that's the idea of the snowman, and you can take it whichever way you want. Is it a snowman that someone built? Is it a person standing in the snow? You know, when do those two things blend and you become part of the landscape, right? But the final stanza, the final three lines of the snowman, and in particular the last two, have caused more confusion among poetry analysts and lovers than almost any other modern American poem. Um, the single sentence, the outpouring of a long cold breath, is coming to an end, right? With syntax to match what is both a climax and anti-climax. So, for the listener who listens in the snow now, right? So they have become part of the surroundings, part of the landscape, because it's not at the snow or to the snow. For the listener who listens in the snow, they become part of it. And nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. So we have our speaker has now become part of the landscape. And since they are part of the landscape, they have become nothing, right? Um, so they've become pure in a lot of ways, right? But then we have our last line, right? Beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. So is it a person who has spent so long out in the cold that they've lost their ability to be? Or is the speaker taking on the role of the snowman, becoming an imagined voice? Or have they become part of the landscape, right? So it becomes a question, again, of perspective and how you can interject yourself in something and just become part of it, right? Um, Normally, when we do this poem, and if we're in person in class, I will, you know, hopefully point out the window and let's say there's someone sitting on a bench. I'm like, they're already there. They're already part of the landscape from our perspective, right, as viewers, is another kind of way to think about this piece. In terms of literary devices, right, we've talked about metonymy. We have alliteration with must and mind, blowing, bear. We obviously have enjambment, right? We have lines moving to the next without any formal stop or punctuation. And there's a lot of internal rhyme throughout the poem, right? Mind, inter, right? That I in winter. Bows, sound, right? There's a lot of that as well. Yeah, so it's a lot going on in that piece. So we're going to end Stevens with, that's not what I wanted to do, with a much more straightforward piece. Disillusionment of 10 o'clock. The houses are haunted by white nightgowns. None are green, or purple with green rings, or green with yellow rings, or yellow with blue rings. None of them are strange, with socks of lace and beaded censures. People are not going to dream of baboons and periwinkles. Only, here and there, an old sailor, drunk and asleep in his boots, catches tigers in red weather. Now, I'm not going to answer the question of why the drunk sailor has the best dreams, because that is your reading response question. But let's almost get there. This is a poem about individualism and experience, and the importance of experience, more so, and the importance of individualism. We start off with haunted houses by white nightgowns, right? And then Stevens points out to us that none of them have any color to them, right? There's nothing interesting about them. They're just blank, boring nightgowns, and he, displays that by using anaphora, right? And then he states that these people that only wear white nightgowns are not going to dream of baboons and periwinkles, right? We don't know what they're going to dream of, but it's not going to be anything interesting. And then we end with only here and there an old sailor, drunk and asleep in his boots, catches tigers in red weather. So how is the sailor different than the people in their white nightgowns? You can take that take into consideration their dress, their experience, right? Potential for individualism. But that will be your Stevens reading response question for this week. Yeah, so I hope everyone has a good weekend. Remember, these are not due until the 1st on Wednesday. And I also did give you guys that extra credit for these being late, so keep that in mind. Yeah, have a good weekend.